bioethics. This installment is called Beyond Words, Walking the Path of Accountability with First Nations Peoples in Healthcare, or Au-delà des mots, le chemin de la responsabilisation en santé avec les personnes Premières Nations,
Beyond
Métis,
Words, Walking the Path of Accountability with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis
I'm
people in
happy to let you
healthcare.
know that we have many ways to join the conversation today. First, we are very fortunate to have live simultaneous interpretation. In order to access the interpretation, you might have to press on the three dots at the bottom of your screen where it says More. Then you choose the icon that looks like a world with some lines in it and says Interpretation underneath. If you choose Off, then you will hear the original voices of the speakers in the language that they are using. If you choose English, then you will hear people speaking in English when they are using English. You'll hear their original voices. But if they switch to French, then you will hear the interpretation in English. And the same for French. If you choose French, then you'll hear their original voices when they are speaking in French, but you'll hear the interpretation when they switch to English. There are many ways to join. You can use the closed captions to capture the sound. You can also ask questions at any point in the Q&A. We will likely answer these towards the end, but you're welcome to put them into the Q&A at any time. You can ask your question in either English or French, whichever is most comfortable for you. When we read your question aloud, your name will not be read. However, the other participants will see your name when it is indicated that we have answered the question live. So if you don't want people to know your name, you can choose to ask your question anonymously. We welcome feedback about this session, and if you would like to give us topics for future sessions, you can contact us at administrator@cbs-scb.ca. I would like to give a big thanks to the Canadian Heritage Grant that is making the simultaneous translation for this event possible. I would also like to let you know that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted to the CBS YouTube page sometime shortly after the talk. You can find our YouTube page by going to the www.cbs/scb.ca, or we'll put a link in the chat. I would also like to direct your attention to our new website. This has been a long time in the making, and it is now live. And there are all kinds of ways to assemble the bioethics community across Canada, and we welcome you to become members. What are the advantages of being a CBS member? Well, it gives you a way to network with peers in a supportive and collaborative environment, and we engage in inclusive dialogue on bioethics issues, and we attempt to advance the cause of bioethics in Canada. If you're an individual member, then you can join the CBS interest groups, which have become very active recently, and I'll say a bit about that again in a moment. It also gives you reduced rates for our conferences and advance notice of all of our bioethics events and opportunities, including job opportunities. You're also eligible to serve on the board and to participate in our annual general meeting. We also have organizational members. Organizational members are institutions or organizations who support us through their generous donations. And our organizational members receive one complimentary individual membership and a discount on all memberships for the members or employees of that organization. There's also a organizational members forum, which you can access by becoming an organizational member. So I mentioned that we now have interest groups, and the conversation series for the 2026-2027 year is going to be in connection with the interest groups. So for this particular installation of the conversation series, it's in connection with the Ethics and First Nations Inuit and Métis persons interest group, where we read authors who are themselves First Nations, Inuit, or Métis people, or who are writing on issues that are important to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we bring in speakers on this topic. And this particular interest group is run by Tim Mount Pleasant and myself. And so if you're a CBS member, you're welcome to join that. Sorry, I have a cold. I would also like to let students know that there is a publication opportunity in association with this event. Um, if you're interested, you can take notes on what the speakers say and then get into contact with the students at CBS-SCB.ca to register for the opportunity. And then they will help you develop a manuscript or a conference proceedings um, that describes the content of this uh, conversation series. And then there's an opportunity to possibly publish your work in the Canadian Journal of Bioethics. Um, it's not a guaranteed publication because it still has to be up to the standards of the journal, but you'll get a lot of mentorship to help you along the way. This event is also a free plenary in connection with the Bioethics Community Forum that is occurring last week and this week. It's taking up again tomorrow for the 27th and 28th, the last 2 days of the event. And the theme this year is trust and distrust in uncertain times. Um, in recognition of the past and ongoing harms that bioethics has done to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and in recognition of the work that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples do when they attend conferences and have to educate bioethicists, this forum is free for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we will be putting information on how to join for free in the chat. Um, you can also still sign up for the second week of the forum. We'll put a link to how to sign up for the forum in the chat as well. So now I would like to give the land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that Tujagi or Montreal is on the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. The land is the basis for all relationships, knowledge, and experiences of health and well-being. Tujagi is a gathering place for many First Nations, including the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Haudenosaunee. And today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous, Quebecois, and Quebecois, and other peoples. And those of us who wish to live here ought to ensure that we respect the relations among the lands, waters, and peoples in a spirit of peace, friendship, and well-being. And there have been some criticisms of land acknowledgements as just being a box checking issue. But one of the things that I think has been very useful about land acknowledgements is that Canadians finally know where they are. So I would say about 10 years ago, Canadians would not have been able to tell you the Indigenous name for the territory upon which they live. But after the practice of giving a land acknowledgement has become common, we now, as settler Canadians such as myself, we now know where we are. Okay, so with those introductory remarks out of the way, I would like to introduce you to our speakers. Uh, Wayne Robinson is a member of the Ojibwe Nation from the community of Bigtgong Nishnabeg, and he has worked within the social services for over 25 years And in the last decade, he's been working with Montreal's urban Indigenous community. He is also a beadwork artist and a podcaster. Joanna Coma Oskaldun Basque est une professionnelle de recherche et de géographie. Ses intérêts incluent la territorialité
Is
et les
a
expériences
research
autochtones de
professional and
banlieue
geographer. Her
urbaine.
research interests
Depuis
include territoriality and
2009, elle
urban
a
indigenous
contribué à plusieurs
experiences.
projets de
Since
recherche
2009,
collaboratifs
she has
avec des
contributed to several
communautés et
collaborative
des
research
organisations
projects with indigenous
autochtones
communities and
ou à la
organizations
sécurisation culturelle
where cultural
dans
safety
ce qui
is a
constitue une
cross-cutting
préoccupation
concern,
transversale, notamment autour de l'accès
particularly
aux
around
soins
access to care,
et de la condition
experiences of
d'itinérance et de
homelessness,
la justice
and
reproductive.
reproductive justice.
And now I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Tim Mount Pleasant. Tim Mount Pleasant is Tuscarora Nation of the Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation, and he is going to moderate our discussion today. Take it away, Tim.
And importantly, I'm missing the hair that was once in that picture. Thanks, Meredith. So Meredith provided a brief introduction of our speakers today. And before the event, we had an opportunity to have some conversations together to kind of chat about what we were going to talk about today. And just briefly, we're going to start with introductions and we're going to move into a brief video that introduces Joyce Echaquan in Quebec, and just warning that there may be material that's triggering for some people in attendance. So we just ask that you mute your volume and step away from your computer for 3 minutes while the video plays. And with that introduction, I'll pass it over to Wayne. I kind of wanted to know, like, when we first had our conversations, how Wayne and Joanna came to meet, all, and how we came to be here, the three of us today. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, First of all, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm very honored to be invited to this amazing organization and in this podcast. I think we're talking about some very important things. Um, I think I've been wanting to practice bioethics for a long time. I've never had the terminology for it, but have, I think like a lot of us working on the ground have seen challenges, and it's good to know. And I think why we're going to start off with talking about choice is when we had our introductory conversation, a lot of that event really encapsulates some of the challenges in a good jumping off point. But yeah, I've been fortunate enough to have spent the last 15 years in Montreal. Um, and here I've had some great opportunities to work with the urban Indigenous population, oftentimes a street involved in homeless population. And through that journey, got to see firsthand a lot of challenges people have with the institution of healthcare and what the outcomes have been. And one of the positive things came out of it is I met one of my good friends, Joanna, because she was able to talk with me as a researcher while I was at Projet Autochtone de Quebec, which is an Indigenous shelter, and a shelter she did some research work at. And now get the pleasure of meeting all of you, including Tim and Meredith. So thank you.
And we're just we're referring to that organization as PAQ, PAQ,
You.
right?
Yep.
So Joanna?
Arratsaldeon deneri, nire izena Joana Komadda. Eskualduna, sokoakoa naiz, baina hogeita bat Montréalen jojoge, bizi naizela. Donc j'ai voulu m'introduire rapidement en basque,
I
qui est
introduced
la
myself
langue de
quickly
chez
in
moi.
Basque,
J'y suis née, j'ai grandi
my
dans
native
ce
language,
si peu
because
l'occasion
grew up in the Basque country. So I never have an
Donc, comme
opportunity
je l'ai dit, je
to
viens
to
du Pays
speak it.
Basque,
So
j'ai
I
grandi
took
dans
it
une
because
zone
I had the
frontière, ce qui
opportunity
fait que
here.
depuis que je suis
It's
enfant, je suis
a
fascinée
border
par
area.
les
So
questions
ever
d'identité
since I was a
culturelle et
child,
comment elles
I've been
résonnent
fascinated by
avec l'espace,
cultural
puisque j'ai
identity
grandi au Pays
issues.
Basque Nord et je voyais bien qu'au Pays Basque
I
Sud,
grew up
c'était pas bien
in
perçu par les gens
the
aussi.
northern
Et
part
je
of our
suis venue
region,
habiter
and
ici
things
donc il
were
y a
different in
21
the south.
ans,
So
dans
I
le cadre de
came
quoi
to
j'ai fait
Canada
mes études. J'ai été
21 years
formée en
ago
tant que
as
géographe
a
à la
student.
mobilisation des
Then I got
connaissances. Donc
training
depuis
as a
15 ans, je ne fais
geographer.
que de la recherche partenariale,
And for
dans
for
le
the last
cadre de
15
quoi
years,
j'étais amenée à
I've
travailler
done
avec différentes
collaborative research.
organisations, comme
I had the
plusieurs
opportunity
centres
to work with many
d'amitié, mais aussi
organizations,
des
like a lot of
organisations comme
friendship
PAC,
centers and other
organisation dans
organizations,
le
like
cadre de laquelle j'ai
Indigenous
rencontré
Project
Wayne il y a
Quebec,
12 ans.
Projet
Et
autochtone du
puis
Québec,
récemment, j'ai collaboré sur des projets qui étaient
as a
dédiés à la
student.
question de
And
la
then more
justice
recently, I was
reproductive
able to
et
work on
notamment
various
dans le
projects
cadre
dealing
de
with
la
reproductive
gynécologie et
justice,
de l'obstétrique, ce qui m'a amené
gynecology, and
à
obstetrics,
collaborer avec la
which
chercheuse
brought me
Atikamekw
to
Suzy
collaborate
Basile
with
et
Susie
notamment
Basile,
sur la
an
question du
Atikamekw
consentement
researcher,
dans le
on the
cadre
issue
des
of
choix
consent.
reproductifs. Alors vous allez comprendre aux exemples que
With
je vais choisir
regards to
aujourd'hui, je
reproductive
choisirai des
choices. So
questions de
you'll understand
sages-femmes
that
notamment,
with what
mais
we're going
aussi en tant
to
que géographe en
talk about
politique
today, I
d'évacuation des femmes
decided to
enceintes.
focus on
Et
midwives
donc, vous allez voir
and
que vous allez le revoir dans tous
the
les exemples que je vais
evacuation
choisir
of pregnant
aujourd'hui.
women. So we will talk about that today. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna and Wayne. I'm just going to move into the video for Joyce Echaquan. So again, if you there might be some content in here that you might find disturbing or triggering. So if that's the case, please mute your audio and step away from your computer for about 2 minutes and 16 seconds. Thanks.
Joyce Echaquan put up this live video from her hospital bed yesterday. The mother of 7 calls out for help. The distress in her voice is obvious. You can hear other voices too. Hospital staff insulting her. Echaquan died shortly after. It's unclear how. Her family says she had gone to the hospital on Saturday with stomach pains. Her husband says now, like that, her 7 children no longer have a mother. Her death prompted calls of justice for Joyce. At this vigil outside the hospital tonight, demands for change.
This is the unacceptable event that we sadly have had to endure for so many decades.
Sadness, we're mad, we just don't understand why Native women, we have to go through that.
The chief of the Atikamekw Council of Manawan, where Echaquan was from, describes her as radiant and says the video is
audiovisual proof
proof
that
of
this was the
systemic
case.
racism. This comes nearly a year to the day after the release of a Quebec report with 142 calls to action that found Indigenous people in the province face systemic racism when accessing public services.
She was a victim of racism.
Today, the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador released its own plan to fight that because it says the government isn't doing enough. The release of their plan today, a sad coincidence, says the Assembly's chief.
It just serves as a reminder that, you know, I guess the mountain is steep, but we have to take it on.
Quebec Premier François Legault has repeatedly denied systemic racism exists in Quebec. Today, he said there will be investigations into Echaquan's death.
The nurses did something unacceptable and she is being fired.
The province says there will be investigations by the coroner and the health authority. But tonight, there are calls to do much more than that. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Joliette, Quebec.
There you go. Thank you. I will pass it over to Joanna and Wayne.
Yeah. You know that the video is so prescient for what we're talking about today. But I think I've been seen it a few times. One thing that I'm walking away right now is that statement from Legault stating that there is no systemic racism within Quebec. And it can help me think about. I used to do a lot of trainings with different professionals, including the SPVM. And one way I thought in Quebec that always connected with people was reminding people of their own history of systemic issues. I mean, what do all of our license plates say? Je me souviens, which is we remember. They're literally the tagline of Quebec is we remember the systemic barriers that Quebecois face. But for that premier to go up and make a statement after seeing that with another community saying there's no systemic barriers in Quebec, oh, it's kind of flagrantly heartbreaking and kind of the I don't know. I know we weren't planning to go in there, but just after he said that, it just kind of made me think like maybe that's a sort of challenge we all have. You know, a lot of times we're very quick to talk about systemic injustices we see, we perceive, we feel, but we don't see how we are sometimes part of that group that is also perpetuating systemic challenges on others. Like Legault is literally the leader of a French-speaking province that's big part of the identity is understanding the systemic injustices that happen to the Quebecois, while not actually seeing that they could also be quite capable in perpetuating similar systemic violence on another community. But sorry, little rant, but yeah, it's always a hard place to start, right? And what happened to Joyce should never have happened. And maybe the thing I wanted to sort of talk about off of that, which is sometimes we find hard to do, is when we think about those nurses and those healthcare professionals. As somebody who's been so privileged to have so many friends, family members go into healthcare, I can't think of one person that went there with the intent of doing harm, right? Um, but what failed in the system, what failed in our community that allowed them in that moment to act with such viral indifference of another human being that had led to outcomes that led to nothing less than their death, right? And how do we as a society tackle that, understand that is, I guess, why we're having this talk today. So I don't know, Joanna, did you have any thoughts on what we just saw?
Oui, tout à fait, Wayne. En fait, je trouve que le
Absolutely,
cas de
Wayne.
Joyce Echaquan, cette
I
histoire
think
terrible,
that
est une belle
Joyce
porte d'entrée au
Ishaquan's
débat,
experience
puisque ce
is
cas-là,
a
si je me
good way
permets
of
peut-être une
opening the
mention
debate.
théorique, ce
I'd
cas-là
like
peut être
to
qualifié de
make a
fait
theoretical
social
reference.
total,
This case
un
is a
concept que
total
j'emprunte
social
à Marcel
fact.
Mauss. Qu'est-ce qu'un
It's
fait social total?
a
C'est un
concept that I
événement,
borrowed from
l'histoire de
Marcel
Joyce,
Mauss. What
qui
is it? It's
instantanément
an
et
event
simultanément va
that
révéler
instantaneously
différents enjeux qui cohabitent dans
reveals
la
various
société au même
challenges that
moment.
exist in society
Ce que
at the same
l'histoire de
time.
Joyce Echaquan nous
So
révèle, c'est
what
déjà la
Joyce
portée
Echaquan's
individuelle, mais
experience
aussi
shows
collective d'un
us
rapport
is the
problématique aux institutions
individual
de
and the
santé où
collective
l'absence de
impact
confiance
of our
va générer une
relationship,
certaine
of our
détresse.
relations
Que
with
donne
the
alors ce
healthcare
cas-ci?
system.
C'est aussi la réponse politique
But it's
qui va y
also
être
the
apportée,
political response
puisqu'effectivement,
to the
comme Wayne le
event.
citait,
As
en
Wayne said,
2021, François
in
Legault déclarait qu'il n'y avait
2021,
pas de
François
racisme au
Legault
Québec, à l'encontre
declared that there was
même de ses
no
propres travaux,
systemic
puisque 2 ans
racism in
auparavant,
Quebec,
la commission
which went
Vien sur les relations
against
entre les personnes
the
autochtones et les
own
services
work
publics
of the government of
avait
Quebec,
déjà
because the Vien
conclu dans ses
Commission
recommandations que la discrimination
or
systémique
public
existait au
inquiry
Québec.
was already
Et ensuite de ça,
investigating
ce que nous
on
donne alors la question de
systemic
finalement la
racism
situation qui
in
impliquait
Quebec.
Joyce
So it
Echaquan,
was
c'est aussi
already
la
a known
réponse
issue.
juridique et la réponse
And there was
légale
also the
de ce
legal
type de
response
situation. On peut
and the
citer,
response
comme on
from
va
the
peut-être en parler
judicial
plus tard,
system.
une
So maybe
coroner a
we'll talk
investigué,
more
la
about
coroner
that
Kamel,
later.
sur les conditions de
Coroner
ces
Kamel
événements. Et
investigated on the circumstances
les
of
conclusions, pour
this
certains, étaient,
sad
si vous voulez,
episode.
ne pas aller assez loin, puisque on se serait attendu à ce que les personnes qui étaient à
And the
l'origine des commentaires
conclusions
racistes, notamment,
reached
perdent leur emploi. En
were to the
l'occurrence, elles ont
effect
juste
that
eu des avertissements. Donc, il y a eu une certaine colère par rapport à ça, et à la fois,
there were
au moins, ça valide
investigations that did not
l'existence
go
pratique,
in
concrète
depth enough.
de ce racisme systémique qui est si difficile à
But what it did
saisir à
is
l'échelle de la société
it
et dont
validated
on
the
doute encore
existence
au
of
XXIe
systemic
siècle
racism, a
de
question that is
l'existence. Et donc,
still
finalement,
challenged
le cas
in
de
the
Joyce
21st
Echaquan,
in the 21st
au-delà
century in
de toutes
Quebec.
les analyses théoriques qu'on peut faire, ce qu'elle
So
fait, c'est que ce
Joyce
cas-là,
Echaquan's
il rend
experience
concret l'absence de confiance envers le système de santé. Voilà, c'est ça
shows
que je voudrais rajouter. Je ne sais
firsthand
pas ce que tu en
the
penses,
lack
Wayne.
of confidence and justifies the lack of confidence from citizens to the healthcare system.
Thanks, Joanna. And in addition to like some of the cultural concerns that the coroner listed, there were some challenges with that are, I guess, common in healthcare and social services. They're not supposed, and I think that good work has been done to address that, but some issues around like a lack of documentation. Uh, it kind of seemed like there was an active attempt to cover up some of the facts that happened. The nurse that was being recorded tried to erase that video from the phone. Medical administration records weren't being kept. The hospital had violated its own restraint policies, and this all seemed to be premised on the fact that there was an initial uh, labeling of Joyce as being drug seeking or something to that effect. But there was the involvement of Indigenous liaison that Joyce had requested, who was barred access from that. And I wanted to bunt it back over to Wayne to talk, I guess, about your experience with being an Indigenous liaison, I guess, the middleman between all Native people on this land and all non-Native people, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept of having navigators, people, the support people going through a system that's there to help and has sometimes failed to do its intended outcomes. Um, Personally, I have seen it where we've gone to hospitals with participants, and a lot of times they'll see me, who identifies and outwardly presents as an Indigenous person, is a family or a friend, and then when I sort of explain that I'm working for an organization, another institution, uh, a lot of times we immediately get a sort of shift in service. I think it works because a lot of times you're meeting healthcare professionals who might see themselves in another worker, right? So you already got a bit more of that solidarity, that empathy that can cross over. But how do we get to a system where we need this, right? And I think one of the important things to understand is the institution of health was an institution that was used to attempt a genocide on Indigenous folks here in Canada, right? That those that are a part of that system are complicit in what it has done. And I think we also need to be just as complicit in coming up with solutions. We know the systems are not adaptable for Indigenous folks, but through their purpose was to deny Indigenous folks the same access, supports that ought to have been given. I think maybe a more interesting question or thing to look at might be is like, what do we do? I can assume through our audience, we have a lot of people working in the institution of health. And I think we always see ourselves as, the good one. Like, what would we do in that situation? And I think, Tim, like you pointed out, that there was a lot of team members, the institution of that hospital itself came together to try to protect that nurse. But where was that organization, those colleagues there when that was happening, that could have done something else, right? I often look at like how we could support each other. Like what could have been a role of another nurse if they overheard that? I'm sure their first motivation probably wasn't like, oh, how do we cover this up? But what if we had a space where another colleague, another service provider could have walked up that nurse and like, hey, let's take a breath. Let's I can understand how frustrating and challenging it is dealing with anybody in dealing with that kind of pain and in that kind of situation. But how do we get to a point where we could, I don't know, support each other better and maybe have sort of like ally engagements where like, hey, what I just heard you said, not cool. Let's take a break. Let's take a breath. And how do we better support this person?
And Joanna, what with regards to the coroner's report, like there are some systemic issues, probably themes that repeat across the province or across the country or across countries. Uh, what did you think of the coroner's report, and did it go far enough in terms of its recommendations, or did it fall short?
Je pense que le rapport du
I
coroner
think the coroner's report went as far as it could. In fact, I think that it went pretty far. I'll get back to that. What Wayne and Tim have noted, and that's what the coroner's report states, is that it underlines the tension that exists, and it has to do with bioethics, between a clinical case and the institutional structure in which it takes place, the clinical case, and that is the death of Joyce Echaquan. What does the coroner's report really say in the end that's important? Well, that the event that took place cannot be boiled down to an addition of individual errors, the nursing staff and so on. Rather, it's a deep-seated institutional issue that's revealed in the way Indigenous peoples are received, are treated, but mainly listened to. And it brings us to issues where ethics cannot solely rest on good personal behavior, individual behavior. Individual treatment is not just dependent on the goodwill of individual actors of the system. To offer them a secure environment for care has to do with structural mechanisms, training, and it's in those conclusions of the Viens Commission, by the way. It can go through governance measures, more liaison agents, and complaints mechanisms that are easy. And Tim said, he talked about the medical records. It looks maybe like not much, but it's a crucial issue. And that's what the Coroner Camel's report attests to. In Joyce's record, there were some medication interactions that were poorly documented. Some of the medication administered made it difficult to understand what was happening to her, at least seen from the outside. And that's one of the initial issues with the medical records. But it's how long they last. That's our key problem. As Quebec residents, you all have access to your online version, but the official paper version of any care acts that you receive in Quebec hospitals, according to the College of Physicians, is 10 years or less of conservation. The consequence of that is that in the case of some traumatic events that created no uncertain distress, they have had to work for years to get better, and often people turn back to the hospital several years after the alleged facts, but then there are no more medical records. So how do you then show evidence that these people received care in an unsafe or insecure environment? So it's difficult from a legal standpoint, from a juridical standpoint, but it's important to document and investigate these cases and be able to reproduce them. If we don't document them, they remain isolated. So systemic racism is something that can happen once in a while, and often that's exactly how it manifests. The medical corps, like any other professional corps, the police, the judiciary, teachers, are of course a core of professionals, and the institutions will back their members. It can't be otherwise legally. It brings us to one last question, that of responsibility versus accountability. And I insist that we have to distinguish between responsibility and accountability, whereas responsibility is turned towards the action itself. I'm responsible for a care or a service to be provided, whereas accountability has to do with the result. Once that action has been conducted, how has it been experienced? Is the person happy? Is there distress? Who's accountable for that? And that will be collective. It could be the institution, the hospital, the healthcare system, society, government, and so on. So it's a very delicate question to look at in the context of systemic racism. Wayne, I don't know if this brings about any thoughts.
I mean, it does. One of the things that maybe the shift and personalize this is what's the solutions, right? Would the solution having more cultural sensitivity training be given to the nurses, to the doctors? You know, if that was me there, would I feel more comfortable if she was swearing at me and Anishinaabe Moyen? No, right? So it's not just about having that understanding that indigenous culture and language, histories, practices are different. It's really about bringing it into like, how do we use that knowledge to support those individuals, right? So it goes beyond, providing something so important, right? Like providing a space for ceremony. We know that institutions that allow for that have better outcomes. But just because someone's Indigenous, myself, for instance, I really identify as urban Indigenous. I have lived in community. I have taken part in ceremony. Um, and I have a great reverence for it. But the same way I sort of moved away, because I used to be very religious, right? I used to be very Catholic. And then as I grew up, I sort of more towards atheist, anarchist. So I guess what I'm saying is just because somebody's Indigenous doesn't mean that the solution always needs to be more Indigenousness. I find a lot more benefit is understanding um, the lived conditions of Indigenous folks, understanding that our language, culture, relationship to land, our spirituality was something that was forcibly taken from many Indigenous folks. So yes, of course, having spaces where institutions make room to bring that back helps, but it's not the answer in itself, right? It is one aspect that I think makes for a better, safer place for, not just Indigenous people, the plurality of cultures and peoples we have across Canada. Having an understanding of this multicultural view where you could, look at the mosaic that's in front of you and support everyone, and knowing that your dominant culture is the only culture will always help. But I think we also need to have the lens of again, we were talking about earlier, the difference between accountability, um, and having that accountability to also acknowledge that we are also part of institutions where we have privilege that was only brought to us by the act of some other group being less privileged, right? Like it's not you can talk to anyone and we can talk about how underprivileged works, but we talk about overprivilege, right? And then what happens once you do have this concept that like, hey, what I have, what we share in this, amazing country we live in, with all the benefits that we have, where we're literally stolen from other people. Um, Sorry, I'm going on a long rant here, but all this is saying, like, there has to be different ways of looking at it, right? And I think it's not an easier answer, but sometimes fully betting on the idea that like, oh, we just need to have more Indigenous spaces in these institutions, without betting what has this institution, what did it do to inflict these harms, right? There needs to be more of that kind of accountability, more when an Indigenous person or a situation comes up. It's not like I'm doing a favor by being nice. It's like, no, we owe this to the Indigenous community because our institutions,
Right.
you know, we have benefited from the immense amount of harms inflicted on another community, the Indigenous community, to be where we are. So it's not about being nice. It's about, no, I have a moral prerogative that I need to be part of a solution that holds ourselves, our institutions, our colleagues, accountable for the harm that has been done historically. And again, this video is from a few years ago, right? We're not talking about harms that the sins of our parents, right? We're talking about a system that exists today where Indigenous folks are served less. The service they get is not as high quality. The outcomes of that systemic racism leads to a place where sometimes Indigenous folks won't even interact with the healthcare system, right? You have people who have ailments that could be detected earlier, sooner, supported and become healthier because of a distrust for a system that almost never acknowledges its own capability. Will avoid those systems, and you'll have something that went from like something acute to something that becomes terminal, right? That didn't have to be. So yeah, we need much more proactive engagement. We need engagement that recognizes one's own personal accountability, but also institutional accountability, and knowing that, yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
I think that one of the recommendations, so there's, I think, a tension, I think, that exists between, I think, within the coroner's report, but also with respect to Joanna and Wayne's perspectives. So on the one hand, you have individual responsibility, and then on the other hand, you have institutional responsibility. And I think they're two different things. I think the coroner's report specifically says that individuals need to remember that they're accountable, they're responsible for their own actions, and there's some critical self-reflection that needs to happen. Like you're an actor within an institution, but you are the person that's acting on another person. When we had our first chat, I never got the chance to ask, but it might be interesting to ask here. You two had disagreed on some kind of approach with regards to this. Joanna, did you want to start? And then
J'ai envie de rebondir. J'ai envie de rebondir.
Well, I do feel like getting back to Wayne's question, and that you're answering as well, Tim. I think it's essential, goes to the heart. Wayne is asking the following: is it enough from the actors in the healthcare system to better know the culture of the patient, or is structural change, in other words, the power relationships, are needed? The asking the question is answering the question. So anybody in the field is unanimous to say that we have to adopt, of course, cultural security and safety, because but it goes beyond the question. It's not just up to professionals to learn the culture of others. It's not, unfortunately, that simple. Ideally, it would be up to the institution to recognize the power rapports, relationships within the system, and from which stem what we can call medical racism. I can revisit that if some want to talk about it. Bringing it back. Now, let's talk about cultural safety. I don't want to say that it's a catch-all, because it is an effective term, but it's pretty widespread, and sometimes we're not sure what it means. Not just because you put a dream catcher in a waiting room, you have you conducted, cultural sensitivity or awareness. This is patchwork. It has to go deeper. Often we talked in the healthcare system of cultural competence. So actors do need to acquire these. Nurses, workers, etc. It also can be liaison agents or others who are dedicated to this, such as midwives. Who trains? Who should train for cultural competence? That's the $20,000 question. And again, Wayne mentioned that we're in a situation where entire societies were culturally oppressed for many generations, enough that the culture be devalued for long enough that it starts to disappear, even though it didn't completely disappear, of course. But now we're hearing we're expecting the First Nations to come and teach us their culture. That's a little ironic. It's people like Wayne who gives the training, and as you heard him, he has a very interesting rapport to culture. We have to get out of the indigenous archetype, the person that's connected to nature and necessarily spiritual. You know, people are in a postmodern world, and they make it up as they go along. And so I think that training needs to be at the heart of the debate, but I don't know if Wayne will be in agreement with me there.
You know, I am right. Like training is definitely a good first step, but I mean, I guess it brings up another question: like, who are we training, right? Like, because this is such a big, complex issue, right? Like, I've done.
So, who will we call upon? In my experience, the elders. The elders have this cultural aura in the communities that quite often that's who we turn to. However, in my experience, it seems to me that they are experiencing a huge pressure, these elders, to transmit the culture. They have lived that culture that was meant to be silenced. So it's another source of distress for those who are called upon to help, for interveners. And that's all I wanted to add. But I have seen it with midwives, indeed.
And maybe this might bring up a good talking point. Is something we can explore. I hope I'm not putting you in a bad situation, but because I know you told me stuff in confidence about, and know that it's one of the reasons I have so much respect working for you is around allyship and having that space where, I know when we were talking about doing this talk together, you were like, I'm not Indigenous. Maybe they should have somebody Indigenous there. But I think your experience as a non-Indigenous person who often collaborates with Indigenous initiatives, is something I think a lot of people possibly in this webinar have a similar experience, right? They're like, I'm not Indigenous. How do I support the Indigenous communities? Is it me quitting my job so an Indigenous person can take it? That's obviously not the answer. But maybe we can talk a bit about what a healthy ally perspective is, right? About not taking space and about using that privilege. Because I think in order to be an ally, you almost always have to have a anti-oppressive understanding that goes beyond what a lot of other colleagues might have. So I guess the question then becomes, what can we say to colleagues if we see them engaging in harmful practices? Because it's, again, you talked about earlier, you can't just always invite an Indigenous person to come in and take on all of that weight, strength. So maybe the question then becomes, how do we support each other? And you're also right, like my nation isn't in Quebec, right? And I practice here. So I'll do a training and a pair of questions like, wait, so which community are you from in Montreal? I'm like, well, my community is actually in Northern Ontario. So yeah, there's no one person that represents every single person, every single situation, right? A situation youth face today is a situation I don't face anymore because I'm definitely not a youth anymore. But yeah, I guess the question is, how do we support our colleagues, or how do we call out our colleagues, or how do we do you have any examples of times that happened to you, or can you think of an example that might be useful? Because yeah, I think you have some unique insights given your own lived experiences.
Je rebondirai sur cette notion d'allié
Well,
parce
let
qu'elle
me
me
get back to
tient à
this
cœur.
notion of
Et
allyship
je vais être
because it's
honnête
near and
avec
dear
la
to me,
synthèse. Moi,
and
je ne me
sometimes,
considère pas comme une alliée.
you know,
Je
like I
suis
don't
une
consider
soldat
myself an ally, and I know that's
en fait,
shocking and
parce que
scandalous to
pour
say.
moi, et c'est comme ça que je le vis,
But this is
être
how I
un allié, c'est
experience
comme un
things.
aîné.
Being an ally
Une
is like being
personne
an
ne
elder.
décide pas un jour d'être
You
un
know, you
aîné,
don't decide
ne
one
décide
day
pas
to
qu'elle est
be an
une bonne
elder, or
personne devient un
you don't
aîné,
say
mais
you're
qu'elle
an
est
elder.
reconnue par sa
You
communauté,
become
par
one
sa
because you're
famille, par ses proches
recognized
comme
by
étant.
your
Et je
close,
pense qu'en
by
tant que
your
personne
your
alloctone, je n'ai pas
community,
intérêt
by
à me
that you
déclarer
are.
allié.
And
Je
as a
suis une alliée
non-indigenous
si des
person,
gens me
it's not in my
reconnaissent
interest
comme
to say
alliée.
I'm
Mais
an
moi, je n'ai
ally.
aucun intérêt à
I
dire je
will
suis
be if
alliée
they
alors.
say I
Parce
am.
que je pense qu'en 2026,
But I think that
l'heure
in
n'est plus aux bonnes intentions,
2026, it's
l'heure
not
n'est pas
about
aux
good
mots, l'heure est
intentions
aux
anymore.
actions.
It's not time for words.
Montrer votre
It's
volonté
time
de
for action.
travailler
Show our
ensemble
willingness to work
et on en
together,
parlera après, quoi.
and
Comprenez?
then
C'est de ne pas mettre la
we'll
charrue
talk.
avant les bœufs,
Okay,
comme on dit,
so
quoi.
let's
Et
not put
donc
the
aujourd'hui,
cart
moi, je me
before
considère pas
the
comme une alliée,
horse.
mais si Wayne me considère comme une alliée, à ce moment-là, j'en
If Wayne
suis
considers me
vraiment
an ally,
honorée, vous
then
comprenez?
I'm
Donc
honored,
c'est
you
le
see,
résultat de
but I
10 ans de
won't
travail.
say I
Je
am.
crois pas
And
du tout
that's
être
the result of
distante des
10 years
alliés
of work.
en tant que
But I don't
personne.
think allies
Voilà, c'est
exist
mon
like
petit point
that
faible.
as indigenous people. That's all I wanted to add.
No, I think that's fair. That's fair, and thank you for that.
And it's
Well,
important,
would
it's important to note that Wayne and Joanna have known each other for a long time, so they are perfectly fine having frank conversations
oh
with one
yes.
another. Yeah, so
It's a tough scenario to be in, right? I can only imagine. And I work with communities that I do not identify from, and I know sometimes that ally perspective, um, in order to just even try to encompass um what you'd want out of it are difficult, right? Like is uh, very big, dark-skinned indigenous man. I often in spaces, I got to be very careful whether or not I'm using my gendered privilege too much, right? And I'd like to think if I do use my voice, my size, my male privilege, I hope it is to amplify the voices of people who don't have that privilege. But um, it's impossible not to sometimes, right? Like just yeah, I don't know about that, but I think these are good conversations to have. These are and they're hard conversations to have when it comes to colleagues and other people that provide service, right?
Hmm.
Ultimately, I think when I was asked to do this talk and when we were brainstorming, I think my mind kept going back to how do we help the helpers, right? Like, I think if there's one thing people could take away from this, one thing that I hope we do more, is about that lateral accountability. It is finding ways, spaces to engage the people we work alongside with, engage the people, our families, our communities that we're from. Um, this is where I think we'll see a lot of change. I mean, where we still needed to support the big movements of bringing in the recommendations of the UN Commission, bringing in the recommendations of the MMOW Commission,
Ouais.
bringing in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Uh, every one of them had a roadmap on how to move forward. And we do not see any of the recommendations in any meaningful way put into action. Those are political questions that take whole communities, take whole groups of people to make them come to light, to make them true, to make real significant help. But in the meantime, we have the water coolers. In the meantime, we have the lunchroom tables. In the meantime, we have the little breaks where you can grab a colleague and be like, hey, let's have a conversation. Hey, I saw what you did. This is what I would have done. Or like, hey, I feel like in my last interaction, I made a mistake. What could have I done better? Right, start with that vulnerability too. Acknowledge that more than likely, I haven't met anybody perfect. Like we all make mistakes. We all need that kind of support. Lifelong learners, lifelong challenging, moving from where we are to where we want to be, and it's those close community members that I think where those changes exist and happen.
And we're just coming up to 2:05 now, so we're gonna
Oh,
do the maybe switch over to what's the fix, some
yes.
solutions type of thing. So when we were chatting previously, like offline, I mentioned Kirsty Duncan, who was Minister of Science and Sport, who brought up with the Hockey Canada fiasco and other fiascos in sport, recommended that it's actually third-party reporting and investigation and a national helpline. Perhaps that leads into that third-party reporting
Mm.
and investigation. And the similar theme came up in Joyce Echaquan's, the coroner's report for Joyce Echaquan, that there needed to be external reporting of deficiencies in certain processes, kind of thing. And so I just wanted to talk, I guess, about kind of what some of the solutions are for,
Mhm.
I guess there's like low-hanging fruit, maybe, and then ideal goals that they could lead to, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a helpline is great. Like mechanisms where we could, I mean, we all hate a surveillance state, right? Like we're not looking at ways to penalize each of us, but I mean, having mechanisms where you're comfortable saying this isn't going well, that we can go to a third party that is able to come in with some insights and you know that could really help. And I can see how that could help, right? Like um if I could share situations I see that had a bit of challenges, not asking someone to get fired, but like asking, hey, maybe we can identify spaces where interventions can happen that could make it better for everyone. I don't know, Yo-Yo or Joanna, do you have any uh, insights?
Ah, moi, tu as dit quelque chose plutôt qui m'a beaucoup inspiré, en fait, qui
You said
résume très
something
bien comment je le vois, à
that
savoir que
summarizes the way I look at
finalement, ce que
things.
tu nous dis, Wayne, c'est qu'il faut
What you're
dépasser
telling us,
la
Wayne, is that we need
réglementation
to
pour
go beyond
embrasser la relation, en fait,
regulations
et
and
notamment au
policies
sein
to
des équipes de
embrace
travail. La,
relationships,
la réglementation,
especially
on ne peut pas y
within
échapper.
work
La
teams.
société fonctionnerait pas
Regulation
sans
cannot be
règlement.
escaped.
Par
Society would
contre,
not be able to work without
on n'est pas obligé de se
regulations and
limiter
laws,
à ça, en
etc.
fait. On peut
But we
enrichir cette
don't need
perception que chaque acteur a de la
to
réglementation avec une autre
constrain
perception qui est
ourselves
plus
to
type
that. We need
relationnelle,
to
en
go
fait. Il faut se
further
parler dans les équipes.
and
Il ne faut pas hésiter
leverage
à confier également de la part
relationships.
des acteurs du
We
système de
need to
santé qu'il y a
talk
un
to our
problème
teams and we
parce que
need
la
to make sure
détresse,
that
elle
we
n'est pas
report
unilatérale. La
issues in
détresse,
the
elle peut être
healthcare
vécue par les
system
équipes qui travaillent.
with healthcare professionals. Distress is
Maintenant, c'est
not
sûr
only
que,
something that
étant
is
donné que je suis
experienced
chercheuse,
by
à
patients,
la
it can
différence
also
de
be
Wayne,
experienced by
la manière dont
workers
je vais
and
avoir tendance à
professionals.
le voir, c'est
Because
moins
I'm a
dans,
researcher, the
finalement,
way
c'est
I look
moins un
at
point de vue
things
bioéthique
usually
pratique qui va chercher à
is
encadrer la
less
décision clinique. D'un point de vue
bioethical
bioéthique
point of
critique, il va
view
plutôt
than a
s'intéresser, et c'est ça
critical
mon intérêt, à interroger
point of
finalement les
view,
conditions sociales, les
leading
conditions
me to
institutionnelles, les
question
conditions
the
culturelles
social
de la
conditions, the
relation, en
cultural
fait. Et
circumstances
notamment,
that
je sais que
nourish
j'envoie beaucoup de mots
relationships.
théoriques comme ça, mais
So I
prenez la
know
question du
this may
consentement.
sound
On
very
sait aujourd'hui que
theoretical,
le
but on the
consentement n'est
issue
pas
of
simplement un
consent, we know
formulaire
today
passive.
that consent
Le
is not
consentement,
just
il est
a
fabriqué
form
dans un contexte
that
social,
you fill out
culturel,
and you sign
économique,
off on.
politique, et
It
tout
has to
ça,
be developed in a
effectivement, s'il
social,
pouvait y avoir
cultural,
des
economic,
formations
political
ou si les
context.
équipes pouvaient être
And
sensibilisées à ces
we
différentes
need to provide
circonstances,
teams
à
with
cet
more
environnement
training
en fait
on
qui
those various
forge et qui accompagne les
circumstances,
soins,
those
peut-être que
diverse
là on ferait
situations
quelque chose, moi je
in
pense.
which
Et bien
care
sûr, là
is
je m'adresse aux
delivered.
personnes
And I think
allochtones
this
notamment,
would
qui peuvent peut-être
operate some
éventuellement se
change.
sentir perdues
I think
parce que
of
n'ont pas les connaissances sur
non-Indigenous
les cultures
people who can
autochtones,
feel a bit
etc. Et
overwhelmed
donc
or
je pense
lost
que
in the
en
face
travaillant
of
sur
an
sa
Indigenous
conscience de soi et dans le
population. So I
relationnel,
think
déjà
that
ça
by
offre une
working on
possibilité
them
de
and on
nuancer
stronger
le carcan
relationship,
professionnel dans lequel
I
chacun
think
est obligé
this will
d'exercer.
allow them
Voilà.
to go forward and beyond constraints.
And so I think some of the audience might be unfamiliar with political organizing for like First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people here. But when you said previously that you worked for one of the friendship centers kind of thing, and like in Indigenous legal traditions, restorative justice is prioritized as a healing of relationships between people. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on how that might be incorporated into this.
The idea of restorative justice is a beautiful one. Um, Personally, I have not seen it put into practice as much as I would like to have seen it, even with Indigenous organizations, even within Indigenous, community members. But yeah, the idea, and I think it was, what I was talking about earlier, right? Like, we're not talking about, a helpline is like a snitch line, right? We're not like, how do you get someone else into trouble? We're talking about spaces, opening up spaces where we could talk about very small to very large harmful behavior that can be explored, discussed, and have a way to move forward that I think in the end of the day would not only support the participant, patient, client, um, but would also support the institution itself, right? Like the 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 reality is the better organizations, institutions adapt. Stuff like restorative justice can adapt stuff like having a better understanding and sensitization to, both indigenous communities and other communities that are not represented. Um, the better it is for everyone, right? Uh, I don't know. I'm always at a loss that we don't do more of this stuff because I think any kind of data we look at, we see how this just supports everyone.
And there are other recommendations in the coroner's report for Joyce Echaquan. Some of them are at the end of the report, but there's others that are uh, embedded in into that. Um, you were I can't remember who said that like hanging a dream catcher is not enough kind of thing for cultural competency. For the indigenous liaisons, we talked about like sometimes I think like there are conflicts that happen inside of institutions like that bioethicists might encounter. Like bioethics still sometimes tries to find a spot at the table and they're developing services within institutions. And like one of the solutions to that might be reliance on peer support workers or patient navigators, patient advocates. In this case, it was Indigenous liaisons. Um, but this liaison was locked out of the hospital when they were trying to access that. What are there other areas that you're aware of that might speak to better integration of uh, lay people, I guess, inside of institutions that have formal roles, I guess?
There's some initiatives we had here in Montreal that I think were really quite amazing. There were like organizations that had not only navigators, but they connected with toll departments, right? Um, I've seen doctors that made a push, within the CHUM, which is a big hospital here in Montreal. They're they had doctors that were like wanting to come to meetings, meet community members. The organization that I met, Yo-Yo, when I was wearing like PAC, has a great relationship now with some healthcare providers, and the work they do is really awesome. And on the flip side, I remember at one point, we saw health navigators be really successful in supporting Indigenous community members moving through the system. And not to say it's a failure in any way, but I thought it was funny within like 2 or 3 years after the first health navigator we got, all of a sudden we had like 20 health navigators throughout the city, Indigenous health navigators, all working for different organizations. Like, not that it's too much of a good thing, because the need out there is so big. We could probably use the 100 health navigators and still not address all the issues. But sometimes I think the onus is put too much on, that individual, to have a necessity to have a navigator every time, without realizing. Again, I'll go back to the idea that from the TRC to the MMIW to the BN Commission, we have roadmaps and we have recommendations, and almost none of them have been successful. And the ones when we hear about this, it's like, oh, what we need is just to be nicer to Native people. What we need is just to have these, again, great initiatives, but initiatives that are easy wins. So let's just hire 20 navigators all over the place, because they do work. But like, where's the effort being put into into having a situation where the premier of Quebec never says there's no institutionalized racism in Quebec? Like when we get to that point, we'll make changes. Right now, our only solutions are having small but useful interventions. We're not making any big movements to move forward. We're putting out little fires while the institution is still burning away, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but like, yeah, like hanging a dream catcher in the emergency room doesn't always support it. I guarantee that there's one Indigenous person that walks in and says like, oh, I feel a bit more welcomed here because they do acknowledge my culture. But like, the solutions need to take part, I think, at higher levels for things to really change and to see real improvements within our communities.
Moi, je rajouterais juste que je suis absolument d'accord avec
I
ça.
would add that I
Je
fully
ne
agree
pense
with
pas
what you
que
said,
tout
Wayne,
l'effort de la guérison
but I
et de la
think that
réparation du
the
passé ne puisse
efforts
reposer
for
que sur des
healing
individus.
and
Bien
repairing
sûr
the
qu'il y a un
prejudices
changement
of
qui
the
doit être
past
structurel.
do not rest on the shoulders of
Meredith a posé une
individuals.
question dans
We
le
need
chat, je me permets
structural
d'y
change.
répondre. Dans le
Meredith
cadre de
asked a question in
ses
the chat,
activités professionnelles,
and I'd
ils
like
se
to
sont rendus compte
respond to it.
que les personnes
Within the
autochtones
context
ne
of our
portaient pas
professional
plainte à
activities, they
travers le
realized
système
that
pour porter plainte classique.
Indigenous
Et donc, en ce
people
moment, de ce
typically
que
do
je
not
crois
file
lire,
complaints
ils sont dans un
within the
travail
existing
pour
structures.
essayer
So now they're
d'adapter
working on
le
trying to
système de
adapt
plainte pour le rendre
the
plus accessible aux
complaint
personnes autochtones. C'est le genre
resolution
de
process
changement
to make it more
structurel que
accessible
j'aimerais
to
voir.
Indigenous people.
Et
And
qui
that's the kind of
permet et qui
structural
ne
change
peut
that I'd
se
like to see
faire
more of. And it
sans
can
la
only be
coopération des
achieved
individus. Je ne suis pas en train de dire que les
with
individus ne doivent pas
the
changer au
collaboration
bénéfice
of
du système. Ils
individuals.
doivent faire partie du
Individuals
changement.
need to
Mais je
change
pense
also,
que
they need to be
la
part of
première
change.
porte
But
doit
I
être
think that the
structurelle, en fait.
first
Voilà.
thing to
Je ne sais
do
pas, Meredith, si je réponds
is
à ta
of a
question.
structural nature. I don't know if that responds to your question, Meredith.
Oui, merci, très bien.
Yes, very well. Thank you. And we have questions from the chat if Wayne wants to jump in on some of these.
Okay.
Okay.
Go on, Tim.
I'm just thank you. There's a one question in the Q&A. Thank you for your very thoughtful and helpful presentation. An issue that arises is that some Indigenous people do not want to be identified or treated differently based on ancestry and feel othered. When this is done, other Indigenous people feel that their ancestry and indigeneity must be recognized in order to receive adequate care. Can you comment on this?
I agree. As an Indigenous person, I've definitely been in situations and felt a bit uncomfortable. I often make this joke about how much I hate camping. It's kind of horrible. It's kind of outdoors. It's kind of gross. So yeah, maybe I do hate camping a bit. But I think the reason I made that joke so much was I had the best meaning communities, employers, friends around me who would often make a mistake like Wayne's Native. he must love the nature. He must just love it so much that he can't think of anything better to do than go camping. I like concrete. I like, doing the other stuff, and like nature is important. We should all be environmentalists. We are destroying the world we're living on. But when those like microaggressions happen, we're like, oh, Wayne's native, he must love camping. Uh, that can be problematic in itself, right? So if I go into an institution and their way of supporting community members is like, oh, Wayne, must speak his language. Unfortunately, my language was stolen from me, right? Like I can tell you what residential schools. I can tell you about, the lost grandparents. I can tell you about how the church forced the language out of my community. I can tell you why I don't have language, but if I walked into a service and somebody started talking to me and under Schnabig I wouldn't be able to respond, right? That actually wouldn't make a service more adapted to my needs. It would actually put another barrier. So yeah, I think we have to first and foremost acknowledge that when we make more inclusive spaces that have spaces that understand that how Indigenous folks have been stripped of their language, of their history, of their relationship to land, of their spirituality. So of course it makes sense to have these organizations have that space, but to only assume and to only insist that the way to move forward is for somebody to adapt all of those things, it doesn't help, right? Like, so I hope I've been making myself clear, and we need that multi-pronged approach, right? Like, it is not a one size fits all solution. And it's not to disparage the solutions that have been attempted, right? It's not to say healing rooms in hospitals aren't amazing things, because they absolutely are. It's not saying having access to elders in health institutions isn't amazing. It is. Are those things personally going to help me when I go? Maybe not, right? Is having the person, the frontline worker, nurse, social worker I'm dealing with, having them have an understanding that is an Indigenous person. I am a survivor of the residential schools. I've attended myself an Indian day school. I've lost very close members of my family through the MMIW crisis. To be in a situation where I don't have to explain all of that history. So having those people that receive me already having a small understanding of that, and not just saying Wayne's native, so he must love camping. Also being like, Wayne's native, oh, we should take into consideration the harms that have been done to Wayne as an individual through this institution, which I'm a representative, and have a better understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, bioethicists often talk about assessing values of individuals, I guess not just based on their culture, but based on their close relationships with people to assess kind of what their values are. So essentially, bioethicists should rely on individual value assessment with patience and not the creed and credence of an individual, I guess. Thanks for that. And if there's any other questions that people have, if you want to pop them into the Q&A, but I'll pass it over to Joanna.
J'ai vu une question, mais elle a
I
disparu.
saw a question, but it disappeared, yet it was very interesting. Don't know if the person left or erased it. Indeed, someone in the audience was saying, I also work side by side with Indigenous people who don't want to be treated differently because they are Indigenous. Why is that an excellent question? because it touches on a paradox. Nobody wants to be treated differently because they are part of another culture, another country. You know, a priori, we're all equal. But the issue with people who are of First Nations origins is that they experience a paradox, and that paradox is the following. And the Joyce Echaquan case shows that these people will be invisible in the healthcare system because they won't be listened to. That was her case. She's saying she's not feeling well, the medication is not working, and the nurse did not listen. And so she's invisible. At the same time, she is extremely visible because Indigenous people, like other visible minorities, are stigmatized because visually they look Indigenous. So they are seated on two chairs at the same time, visible because Indigenous, and invisible because not listened to. And I understand why this member of the audience, said that they didn't want to specify or share that they are Indigenous. That's all I wanted to add to that.
Thanks for that. Wayne, did you have anything to add at the end of our conversation here? I'm seeing one other question. Okay, I am a clinical ethicist who frequently works with Indigenous patients' families. I find there is a tension between wanting to more deeply understand the perspectives of Indigenous patients' families while also recognizing that I have not earned their trust and would expect that they may not feel able to share their concerns, preferences, values, etc. Which approaches would you suggest for coming into those conversations in a way that reflects this person's awareness of the many institutional harms experienced by Indigenous peoples and conveys a genuine openness and invitation to understand their perspective?
I mean, that's it. I think that person has nailed what needs to happen. It's understanding that the historical traumas have happened. Not having expectation of one webinar or one Indigenous sensitization session makes you the perfect ally. Understanding that these conversations might still be hard, but I think with honesty. You could be like, talk to the family members, find an appropriate way to be like, hey, is there anything else I should know? I feel whoever wrote a question like that already has a good understanding of the historical traumas done amongst the Indigenous communities. And then where do you go from there, right? Um, you definitely don't need an individual person to come to if I go to the doctor, I don't think resharing 500 years of the attempted genocide of my peoples plays into why I went there with a cough. But it might, right? So knowing that doctor maybe did that homework beforehand, is helpful. I mean, to be so bold as to say, attending a webinar like this is a huge step. I mean, I think within every one of the recommendations from every one of the inquiries we saw, a big one is just educate yourself. We're doing this right now. We are having these conversations we don't have. We are in a space where our minds are already starting to move to that idea. Having that reflex to ask that question, I think you're well on your way. And yeah, I just want to say how amazingly fortunate I am to have been invited to have this conversation with everyone. I apologize for all my ramblingness. I know I can often go on too long, but yeah, I've also had a really good time, and would welcome people to reach out for more conversations. And yeah, such great work by this organization putting this on. Very impressed.
Thanks, Wayne. And I think that kind of mirrors to some of the concerns of the, I think it was, I don't think it was in the coroner's report. I think it was in the Assembly, Chief of the Assembly of First Nations for Quebec and Labrador, saying that it seems like we keep saying, reports keep saying the same thing. Starting with RCAP, right? The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, MMIWG, coroner's report after coroner's report in Ontario and Quebec, potentially. Thanks for that. And Joanna, any final words?
Merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I had just a wonderful time. I'm very, much friends with Wayne, so as usual. And thank you for the questions that there were that I found very interesting. And you can find me on internet if some people would like to pursue this conversation with me. I'd be delighted.
Thank you. And I'd just like to pass along appreciation from the CBS president, now President Marika Warren, who just says just a massive appreciation and gratitude for this conversation, particularly for the nuance and complexity and critical thinking, as well as for the genuine dialogue and respectful disagreement that Wayne and Joanna are demonstrating. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have collaborated with you on this, and I look forward to future conversations that we might be able to have. And I'm just going to pass it over to Mayor. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone for engaging in this wonderful conversation. And thanks to the audience for adding their questions to the Q&A. There's a lot of appreciation for our speakers that has been added to the Q&A. And so thanks, everyone. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a dialogue that we can continue in various other ways. So now join me in thanking our speakers and our moderator.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.